The moment the detective looked at me across that laminate table and said, "Mrs. Harlan, you're either the most innocent woman I've ever met or the most dangerous." I thought about all the years I'd spent being invisible, and I decided I was done with that. My name is Irene. I worked in a flower shop. That's what my neighbor would have told you. That's what the school registration form said. That's what my husband told his colleagues when they asked. "Oh, Irene? She works in a flower shop. You know how it is." And then he'd smile in the way that made clear no one needed to ask further questions. I was the kind of woman people look at and don't see. I was fine with that for a long time. Margaret had opened the salon almost 8 years before any of this happened. She was pushing 70 and made no effort to hide it. Silver hair piled high, dramatic perfume that arrived in a room before she did, laugh that rattled the window glass. She'd been a stage actress in her younger years, then a widow, then inexplicably a businesswoman. She'd taken me in after my grandmother died. I was 26 and lost, the kind of lost where you stand in a grocery store for 10 minutes and then leave without buying anything. Margaret had known my grandmother since before I was born, and she called me the week after the funeral and said, "Irene, you have an eye for beauty. Let me pay for the courses. The rest you'll figure out yourself." She also taught me how to drive, and how to put on lipstick, and a few other things that turned out to matter more than I expected. She had one firm rule about the shop: no exotics. Just what people actually want. I agreed. And then spent the better part of a decade quietly disagreeing in my head. The man who funded the shop was one of her many admirers. She had a rotating constellation of them, which she managed with the expert indifference of someone who'd been adored too long to be impressed by it. She never married any of them. She said she was waiting for someone who made her nervous, and hadn't found him yet. That changed later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My husband Martin had a job that required him to travel. He was a senior regional logistics manager for a large distribution company, which sounds like something you'd describe to put a child to sleep. He wore it the other way, spoke about it at dinner parties like a man who'd discovered fire, referenced market dynamics and supply chain restructuring with the gravity of a surgeon. He was gone 3 or 4 days out of every week, and when he was home, he filled the silence with opinions. He thought the flower shop was charming, in the way people think regional theater is charming. A pleasant, harmless thing, not serious. He did not say this directly. Martin was never direct. He said things like, "Must be nice to keep life simple, and I suppose someone has to sell roses," with that half smile that let him deny the insult if you called it out. I didn't call it out. We'd been married 7 years. We were respectful to each other the way neighbors are respectful, carefully, because you have to share a hallway. There was no romance left. But he brought me small gifts from his trips: a painted wooden spoon, a ceramic magnet, a silk scarf he'd found in a market somewhere. It was something. I won't pretend it was nothing. And 3 years ago, he agreed to something I'd wanted for a long time. We adopted a boy. Danny was 5 when he came to us. Dark-eyed, watchful, the kind of child who studies adults like he's taking notes. By the time this story takes place, he was 8 and utterly devoted to soccer, and he'd asked to spend the summer at a sports camp, and Martin had written the check without complaint. That surprised me more than it probably should have. Martin was not what anyone would call a warm father. He'd told me once, flat and factual as a weather report, I grew up the 5th of 7 kids. I've heard enough crying to last 3 lifetimes. I'm glad the boy came to us old enough to carry on a conversation. And then he'd return to his newspaper, and we never discussed it again. Danny knew. Kids always know. He'd given up trying to get Martin's attention by age 6, and redirected everything towards soccer, toward me, toward the elderly lady down the hall who let him water her ferns. I loved that boy, the way you love someone who chose you when they didn't have to. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I found the compartment. Martin's car was in the lot when I got home from the shop, earlier than expected, which already felt wrong, the way a bird going quiet feels wrong before a storm. The car was filthy. Not I drove through a muddy road filthy. I drove through a field that shouldn't exist filthy. He was already in bed. Half asleep, he mumbled something about being exhausted and please not to wake him. Of course, I said. Sleep well. I lay in the dark for an hour. Then I got up, took his keys from the hook by the door, and went down to the parking lot. I drove to a self-service car wash 2 miles away. Margaret had taught me to drive on a '92 Buick, with a stiff clutch. And I'd never forgotten the way the wheel pulls left when you're nervous, the way you have to ease off before the turn. I washed the outside myself. Then I opened the trunk to clean the interior. The floor mat was domed in the corner, unnatural. I lifted it. There was sand everywhere, enough sand that I thought of the beach, which made no sense, because Martin had not mentioned a beach. And then I saw the panel, a thin metal rectangle, recessed into the floor of the trunk, imperfectly seated. Just enough off-center that the mat wouldn't lie flat. I opened it. Inside was a Ziploc bag, thick and soft with the weight of paper. I carried it to the back seat and unzipped it under the dome light. Stacks of currency. Dollars and euros, banded in the way banks band currency. A leather makeup case. Quality leather, the kind that costs more than my monthly rent. Inside the case, folded in a square of velvet. Stones that caught the light and threw it back in pieces. Diamonds, I thought, or something very much like them. Car keys on a fob I didn't recognize. A foreign passport, which I opened slowly. The photograph was Martin's face. The name was not Martin's name, and behind it, a birth certificate. 5 years old. The father's name matched my husband's real name. The mother's name was a woman I had never heard of. I sat in that car for a long time. I don't know how long. At some point I noticed I was holding onto the seat back with both hands, and I made myself let go. I photographed everything. The contents of the bag. The compartment itself. I did it slowly, methodically, the way you do things when you're trying not to fall apart. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. Closed the compartment, smoothed the mat. Drove home. He didn't stir when I climbed into bed. I lay there until 4 a.m. listening to him breathe, trying to figure out who I was sleeping next to. There is a man named Gerald who buys white lilies on the 15th of every month. He'd been coming in for years. Widower, early 70s. Military bearing that some men shed when they retire, and others keep until they're buried. He always bought the same thing, always left exactly as he'd come. Quietly, efficiently, with a nod that somehow said more than most people's speeches. Margaret adored him, though she'd never said so out loud, which meant it was serious. I told my best friend first, which was a mistake. Claire and I had known each other since art school. We'd met in a color theory class and stayed close through 2 decades of bad decisions and good ones. She was a street artist, freelance, always between projects. Margaret thought she was a bad influence. Margaret was not entirely wrong. I sat across from Claire at the cafe, 2 blocks from the shop, and told her everything. The compartment, the passport, the name I didn't know. She stirred her coffee and said, I'd move fast. Police don't care about marriage when there's money involved. And you've got Danny to think about. I asked her what she thought I should do. She told me to put his bags outside the door and file for divorce. Then she left, and I found out later, much later, where she went. She went to Martin. She'd been going to Martin for over a year. He'd found her one night, on a parking structure, arguing with debt collectors over a stack of microloan statements. She'd borrowed more than she could pay, chased some idea of one good summer, and come back to find her clients had moved on. The collectors were circling. Martin had paid the debt, in full, in exchange for information. She told herself it wasn't so bad. That Irene never said anything important anyway. That she was just keeping a friendship alive. The little voice that disagreed with her, she learned to keep it very quiet. I had my last day at the shop 3 weeks later. I'd been making mistakes, misremembering orders, giving wrong change, putting white roses in a sympathy arrangement when someone had specifically asked for yellow. Margaret called me into the back room on a Thursday afternoon, sat me down, and looked at me the way only someone who has known you since you were small can look at you. Irene, she said, you look like a woman who hasn't slept in a month. I'm fine, I told her. You are not fine, she said. And I need you to take some time off. Paid. For as long as it takes. But I can't keep having customers return bouquets. She said it gently, which somehow made it worse. I worked my last shift, accepted deliveries, trimmed stems, arranged and rearranged the front display until the shop was empty. And then Gerald came in. Not on the 15th. Just came in the way people do when something nudges them toward a place they're needed. He looked at me for a moment, and then said, "Are you all right? You haven't looked like yourself in weeks." I said I was tired. He said, "Would you like to get coffee? You can tell me whatever you'd like, or nothing at all." We sat at the cafe on the corner, the one with the faded green awning and the wobbly tables, and I told him everything. He listened the way investigators listen. Not interrupting, not reacting, absorbing. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "The hot drink in your thermos. Who makes that for you?" "Martin," I said. "He's been brewing me rosehip tea. Says it's good for energy." Gerald held out his hand for the thermos. "May I borrow this?" He took it. Then he told me not to eat or drink anything from home. To pretend everything was normal, but to pour away anything Martin gave me. To sleep as much as I could. "There will be a period that's very hard," he said quietly. "Withdrawal from certain medications is not easy, even in a healthy person. Be patient with yourself." I stared at him. "I was a prosecutor," he said, "for 31 years. I've seen this presentation exactly twice before, both times in patients, who were being actively medicated without their knowledge." He looked at me over his coffee cup. "You are not losing your mind, Irene. Someone has been trying to make you lose it." I cried in that wobbly chair, in front of a man I barely knew, at a table with uneven legs, while the afternoon traffic moved past the window. I was not embarrassed. I was too relieved to be embarrassed. "I'll take the thermos to my nephew," Gerald said. "He's a toxicologist at County General. We'll know what's in it by tomorrow." The next 24 hours were the worst of my life, and I've had some bad ones. Without whatever Martin had been feeding me, my body staged a full revolt, chills that shook the bed frame, heat that soaked through 2 sets of sheets. I lay on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m. thinking, this is what withdrawal feels like, and somehow, that thought, clinical, specific, true, made it slightly more bearable than believing I was dying. Gerald called the next evening and said, "We need to meet." I went. I was still unsteady on my feet, but I went. He was at the cafe with a young man I hadn't met, tall, dark-haired, the kind of careful attention in his eyes that takes years to develop. His name was Frederick. He was Gerald's nephew and, as it turned out, a man with a very particular skill set and a complicated relationship with his uncle's retirement. "There was a substantial dose of a heavy psychiatric drug in your thermos," Frederick said, watching me the way doctors watch patients they're deciding how worried to be. "In someone with a weaker cardiovascular system, it could have caused cardiac arrest. Do you know how much of this you were drinking per day?" "A full liter," I said. "I took it everywhere." He closed his eyes briefly, then said, "You have a strong constitution. And good timing." I asked what it was going to do to me in the long run. He said, "Get the rest of it out of your system, and I think you'll be all right. Come to my lab tomorrow. I want blood work, hair samples, nails. I want a complete picture of how long this has been going on." Gerald ordered me a proper meal, which I ate in about 4 minutes flat, and then walked me through what he'd already started to piece together. The company Martin had registered in my name. The debt, millions of dollars, connected to that company. The laundering operation it had been running for years, using my signature on documents I'd signed during a dinner. I barely remembered. No point. When Martin had poured wine and then passed me papers in the candlelight, and I'd signed them because I trusted him. Because I was his wife. He was planning to disappear, Gerald said. The passport, the foreign accounts, the exit route. He needed you neutralized, either institutionalized or dead, before the company came under scrutiny. Because when it did, your name would be on everything, and he would be gone. I sat with that for a while. The ceiling fan turned slowly overhead. Country music played from somewhere behind the counter. Something old and slow, a woman's voice, heartbroken and steady. "What about Danny?" I said. Gerald was quiet. "I don't know," he said, finally, honestly. I don't know what he planned to do about the boy. I think that was the moment I stopped being afraid and started being furious. And fury, it turned out, was much more useful. I did what Gerald told me. I went home and let Martin see me shuffle across the kitchen in my socks. I let him find me, staring at the wall. I took the tea he made me and poured it into the soil of the parlor fern while he was in the shower. I drank water from the bathroom, tapped with the door closed, then came back to the couch and looked blankly at the television. He seemed satisfied. That was the hardest part, watching him be satisfied, watching him interpret my performance as his victory. He'd put something in my tea, and he'd told the neighbors I was unraveling. He kept going, and he was moving through our apartment like a man who'd already packed up and left. Danny was still at camp. I was glad he was at camp. Frederick drove me to visit Danny on a Thursday. Gerald's idea. Don't let Martin know where the boy is, he'd said. Make sure he feels safe and separate from this. And Danny was fine, sunburned and breathless, telling me about penalty kicks, with the passionate detail of someone who has discovered something worth caring about. I held him longer than usual when I left. He let me. Frederick and I talked the whole drive back. He made me nervous, in the way good things sometimes do, when you're not sure yet if you're allowed to want them. He also lectured me about the danger of what Gerald had them all doing. Said his uncle had been bored since the funeral and had invented symptoms to have something to investigate. Said it was irresponsible. Said all of this while absolutely helping. Your uncle doesn't have a terminal diagnosis? I asked. He has a tired heart, Frederick said. Which is different. The family told him otherwise because it was the only thing that got him out of bed after Aunt Louise died. That's either very loving or very cruel, I said. Both, he said. We're a complicated family. I laughed for the first time in weeks. It felt strange in my chest, like using a muscle I'd forgotten. Martin left on a Tuesday morning, cheerful in a way that turned my stomach, kissing my forehead like I was something fragile he was setting down carefully before walking away. Be a good girl, he said. I'll be back soon. He didn't come back soon. He drove across the state line, picked up a package from a contact in a warehouse district, and came home 3 days later to sleep. Gerald's nephew had tracked him the whole way. Not officially, not with authority, just with a car and a lot of patience. What Martin was carrying was a necklace, a piece from a private collection that had been reported stolen 6 months prior. The stones were each the size of a fingernail, brilliant cut, old European craftsmanship. The man waiting for them was a man I'd never heard of. A name, Gerald said quietly. In the way you say the name of a weather event. The woman who had his child, Gerald told me, is his daughter. She's been Martin's other life. His exit plan involved stealing this necklace, handing it off, collecting his payment, and then disappearing before her father could ask questions. He was planning to leave her behind, too. He was going to leave everyone, I said. Gerald nodded. Yes, that was always the plan. Here is what you need to understand about the necklace. The man who wanted it was not a man who accepted disappointment gracefully. And Gerald had contacts from 31 years of prosecution that did not expire simply because he retired. One of those contacts was a jeweler who owed him a favor large enough that a replica, convincing at a glance, ruinous under a loupe, could be produced in 48 hours. And I had made a set of wax impressions of Martin's car keys on a night when he'd left them in his coat pocket, and I'd had exactly 4 minutes while he moved his suitcase from one room to another. Margaret had taught me that. Lockpicking, wax impressions, the mechanics of duplicates. She'd learned from an actor who'd played a safe cracker in a regional production and taken his research too seriously. She'd never expected to use it. Then again, neither had I. The night Martin came home with the necklace and slept the sleep of a man who thought he'd won, I slipped out of the apartment at midnight, crossed the parking lot in October cold, and let myself into his car with a copy of his keys. Gerald was waiting by the garage wall, leaning on his cane, with the carved handle, looking like a man who was supposed to be somewhere warm and had chosen instead to be here. He handed me the replica. I opened the compartment, lifted the velvet, and felt the weight of the real necklace in my palm, dense and cold and ancient, the way beautiful things sometimes are. Even in the dark of a parking garage, the stones threw back the light from a distant fluorescent panel. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to. "Don't get sentimental," Gerald murmured behind me. I put the replica in and closed the compartment. Martin drove to the meeting the next morning looking like a man who'd already spent the money. The handoff was in a warehouse on the far edge of the industrial district, the kind of building that would be unremarkable from a distance and very cold inside. Martin opened the compartment in front of the man he'd been carrying for, and the man's expert, a jeweler with a loupe and the expression of someone paid to find problems, had the verdict in under 90 seconds. "Counterfeit," he said. The rest of that meeting did not go well for Martin. While he was on his knees in a warehouse trying to explain something he didn't understand, Gerald and Frederick and I were sitting in a police precinct conference room with a retired prosecutor's connections, a toxicologist's lab reports, 3 months of camera footage from the apartment, and a complete paper trail of the company that bore my name. Gerald had also, without telling anyone, placed a GPS tracker on Martin's car 2 weeks prior. He slid the phone across the table to the detective. "They moved him," he said. "You have about 40 minutes." The detective looked at the phone. Looked at Gerald. Said, "You realize you're lucky I know you, Jerry." "Isn't everyone?" Gerald said. They arrested Martin in the second location. They arrested the crime boss at his daughter's house, where he'd gone looking for answers about the necklace, with the baby crying upstairs, and the daughter trying to understand what was happening to her life. They arrested Martin's crime boss's network across 4 warehouses and a web of shell companies, and they arrested a woman named Claire in the middle of the afternoon on the north side of town. Martin had given Claire's name freely, apparently believing that being forthcoming about her would help his case. It did not. Gerald told us all this in Margaret's living room, over a dinner she'd cooked herself, looking 10 years younger than he had in September. Margaret kept refilling his coffee cup and pretending she had reasons to stand close to him. "They're giving me a commendation," Gerald said, with the bashful pride of someone trying not to seem proud. "As they should," Margaret said firmly. He looked at her. She looked at him. I looked at my soup. Some things don't need annotation. The apartment search took most of a day. When it was done, Margaret came over and sat across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where Martin had poured wine and slid me papers to sign years ago, and said, "I want to talk to you about something." She put a folder on the table. "I'm not as young as I used to be," she said. "And I never wanted just the one shop. I wanted a network. I wanted something that lasts." She pushed the folder toward me. "You have better taste than I do. You always did, even when you were letting me pretend otherwise. I want to bring you in as a partner. Equal stake. We opened 3 more locations this year, more after that. You hire the staff, you train them, you run it. I'll be there for the things that need an old woman's judgment." "Which is more than people think," I said. "Considerably more," she agreed. I looked at the folder. I thought about the conversation I'd wanted to have with her 8 years ago, about ranunculus and hellebore, and the fact that no exotics had always seemed like a rule that deserved to be reconsidered. "I want to carry exotic flowers," I said. "Real ones. The kind that take patience." She was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled the way she used to smile on stage, broad and genuine, and full of something that looked very much like relief. "Deal," she said. There were 6 months of depositions, hearings, and paperwork. There were meetings with lawyers who cost more per hour than I made in a day. There were forms and filings and a court date where I sat in a wooden chair, in my good coat, and the judge said my name the way judges say names when they're done with you. Neutrally, with finality. And then I walked out into the October air, and that part of my life was over. The company was dissolved. The debt was reassigned. My name was cleared. Martin went to prison. He tried several arguments. None of them worked. We opened the first new shop in the spring, the second by July. The central location, the one that was mine to design, had a window full of things Margaret had never allowed. Tuberose and bird of paradise, hyacinth in season, anemone, the particular deep blue violet of hydrangeas that's almost impossible to find if you're not looking for it. Customers stood outside and took photographs. I hired 3 people and trained all of them myself. I saw a woman with Frederick outside the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon. She had her hand on his arm, and he was leaning toward her, and they were talking closely. The way people talk when they've known each other long enough to forget their distance. I watched from the car. Margaret, who was driving, said nothing. 3 days later, he pulled up outside my shop, and I told him I was busy. He said, "Irene, that's not what it looked like." I said, "I've heard that before. I'm sure you understand why I'm not in a position to take that on faith." He left. I closed the shop, pulled down the blinds, sat on the low stool in the dark behind the register, and cried until I didn't have anything left to cry with, which took longer than I expected. I'd apparently stored more of this than I knew. Gerald showed up at my door on a Saturday with Danny standing next to him, which was irregular enough that I knew something was coming. The woman, Gerald said, before he was fully inside, is his sister, Lenora. She works at County General, different wing. He asked her to come by on 2 separate occasions to see if you'd react. He paused. Apparently he wanted to know if you had feelings for him before making a fool of himself. I stared at him. "I know," he said. I told him the same thing. Idiotic. I raised him better than that. He opened the front door behind him and called into the hallway. "Frederick." "She's heard it. Come in and apologize like a grown man." And Frederick came in, carrying a cake box, and Danny launched himself at him from the hallway with a noise that suggested the cake box contained something with a remote control. It did. I took the cake into the kitchen. Frederick followed. He stood in the doorway and said, "I should have just told you who she was." I don't know why I thought. You were nervous," I said. "Yes, about me, yes." I took 2 plates from the cabinet. "Sit down, Frederick." He sat. The cake said something in frosting. I didn't read it right away. I cut 2 pieces and put them on the plates and sat down across from him, and we ate in the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. From down the hall, Danny's voice rose in celebration over something automotive. Outside, the October sky was going the particular orange-gray color it gets over a city in autumn, the last of the light catching the top edge of the buildings and then letting go. I had flowers in every room of the apartment. That was new. I'd never had flowers in the apartment before. Martin had been allergic, or so he'd said. I'm not sure I have a lesson for you. I'm suspicious of lessons. The people who've had the worst happen to them are rarely the ones who emerge with tidy insights. Mostly they emerge with gratitude for small things. The color of light at a certain time of day, the sound of a child getting excited about something, the way someone can sit across a table from you and not ask you to explain yourself. I was invisible for a long time. I chose it, partly. And then someone tried to make it permanent, and that was when I discovered I had an objection. Some wounds close and some don't. The 7 years with Martin didn't disappear. The papers I signed, without reading, the trust I gave away to someone who was counting the drawers. Those don't vanish because a judge says your name cleanly. But Danny is 9 now. He scored his first proper goal last month and came home with his cleats still muddy and told me about it in so much detail I could have drawn a diagram. Frederick drives badly and apologizes well, and is going to figure out, over the next few years, that this is enough. And Gerald is alive in ways he wasn't 6 months ago. Margaret keeps him that way, mostly, armed with opinions and very good coffee, and he has finally stopped pretending he doesn't like it. There is a corner window in the central shop where I put the rarest things. The ones that need patient people come in and stand in front of it and don't always know what they're looking at, but they know it's worth stopping for. I think about that sometimes. How long something can grow in the dark before it finds its way to the light. How it does it anyway.